Okay. Hi, everyone. We got a big group here, huh? So if you're online, we have 4 people in the audience, now 5, including Francesco. Anyway, well, I will be, let me get rid of this thing. I will be presenting some work today that spans a range of media. A lot of the technology in my work is hidden. So I use things, but I make a point of sort of hiding what that was. It shouldn't be the foremost thing. You know, it's like saying I make art about graphite or I make art about photography. You know, those mediums are fine, but it's not as though we celebrate those things. So, you know, one day AI will be historical, just like screen printing and lithography. You know, it's still used in fine art departments, it's used in industry, but it's not like we hear a whole lot about that, right? So I'm interested in what that looks like. You know, I try to imagine a future where you look back and make sense of what you do. And, you know, artists are probably well known for being egotistical, caught up in their legacy, you know, trying to make an impact. But a lot of that is because they want to make their work relevant within an art historical context or something like that. So anyway, just a little background. So let me forward to another slide. Why can't I access my sorry, folks. For some reason I can't
What happened?
I can't access my controls.
You cannot access your control?
Yeah, I can't forward the slide.
Okay, we need to get, yeah, you need to get out of,
Stuck here.
you go.
Oh, what did you just do?
That's pretty cool.
Oh, stop.
Oh. Okay, it works.
All right. Now I have more control. Okay. So I'll show you a few series that I work in. So if you're not familiar with artist work, they often happen in series. And they help to make sense, to put a little bit of structure around what it is we do. So if you've ever been to my studio, you might have been confused because there's a lot of things going on at the same time. A lot of things happening in parallel, tangentially from one another. And sometimes very linearly, depending on, like right now, I don't have a lot of time in the studio, so I'm very hyper-focused on particular things. So in this series, we have Bloom. So Bloom is the oldest series that I'll be showing you. Hotel Mirror is more recent, and most recently is the Lobby Flowers. And the last 2 are part of a larger cycle that I'll try to give a little bit of background. All right, so some old school tools right here. On the right, this is called a glass muller, and a muller is something that is used for making paint. And on the left is a nice clean tube of paint that I made with that tool. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about being and becoming through some Greek mythology that I like to incorporate, different thoughts that I like to explore in the process. So in this piece, you said this idea of being and becoming, in the larger sense, is thinking about the transformative impact of art. So starting with the beginning, making something from nothing, right? You literally start with a blank page or the thought on paper, and then you have something, right? And obviously that process can be messy. It can be, it's very human. Technology can be involved, right? It doesn't have to be. Digital, it can be starting with graphite, just sketching out your plan, thinking about what you want to do. In this case, there are a lot of things that happened here. So this is the second iteration of this project, and so this was in downtown last July. Sorry, two summers ago, July. And our own Bernie Robert from Georgia Tech was the curator for this. And so anyway, you can see a couple of changes as the animation progresses. So this came out of an old, this process was a little different for me, but it was about my interest in genetic engineering. And part of that was in the sense that it really, my interest in that started probably 20 plus years ago. And in this case, my interest was taking these different time-lapse flowers and bundling them together into this animation. But the way that I structured it was almost like a visual symphony, where I plotted the colors over time, how they would come about, crescendo and so on, and it was built on a loop because it was originally intended to be a billboard at a different location. And lo and behold, 15 years later, it actually was on a billboard. So this was a lot simpler process because it was professional and digital. Back when I first did it, it was on a computer was outdoors on a rooftop. It had to be waterproofed. It had a projector. I mean, try and imagine I had to come back over and over and over and turn it back on, restart the computer. And so for it to become, a legitimate thing downtown through an organization, dashboard, et cetera, was pretty great. Okay, so heading into Hotel Mirror. Hotel Mirror, you should see Francesco's face right now if I could paint it. It would look better than this image that he's reacting to. So Hotel Mirror thinks about the idea of a hotel mirror, right? So I'm engaging with the history of portraiture in this series of work. And this was about the time that I started to get interested in AI. And some of the images actually predate the beginning of the VIP project that we started 6 academic years ago. So, and this was based out of a series of motifs that were used for teaching art that Van Gogh used, that Picasso used, and it was a 19th century textbook that came out of Jerome's studio in Paris. And it was very structured such that you couldn't progress to various types of activities before doing the original things, right? So it's very old school in the sense that you had to draw from a plaster cast before you could actually draw from a real life model, right? So you had to prove some level of skill before you could move on. And anyway, there were different eyes that came in this textbook. And at the time, the algorithm that I had for creating faces, for creating prompts to make faces by hand or digital, there was the assumption that it was always 2 eyes. And it suddenly occurred to me that, well, maybe it's more than 2, right? Or maybe it's more than 1 nose, et cetera. And so the game expanded. So here's an installation at the Samuel Hudson Gallery. This was in COVID times, unfortunately, in 2021, so we couldn't have an opening. We weren't allowed to have, more than 20 people. I was allowed to do something privately, but it really languished in the sense that it was like nobody knew that it happened. Which is interesting given the subject matter, because a lot of the thought is the privacy of the ephemeral nature of a hotel room, the fleeting nature of it. When you think about movies or directors that take on hotels, there's talk of the in-betweenness of that space, right? So something that's not quite the normal space. And what's interesting about that for me is the fact that that's what art is. Right, so I'm interested in the mirror world of art, right? So we might look at a photograph. We might take reference from a live person or a nature or whatever, but in the process, it's transformative, right? There is a metamorphosis that happens. So, looking back at the animation, even though you didn't see the live animation, there was this metamorphosis that happens, right? The time lapse of the flowers, but it's abstracted down. You don't necessarily know what the species are, right? They were lilies, you didn't know that, but it was transformed into something else. So this is Francesca's favorite picture.
Yeah.
And so you'll notice there's a little bit of color loss from what's live in the classroom versus what's on the screen. So color is very important to me. It's probably one of the primary areas of interest that I have
And why?
in making art. Just calibration. It was very difficult to photograph this because of the plexiglass. And so the photographer had to do a lot of tricks to eliminate the glare, but in the process, some of the color was lost. There was a issue with getting it photographed before it was framed. So there's a little bit of a loss of color fidelity there. So here's, okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about that picture. I'll come back to it, Francesca's favorite. So there is some AI involved in this image.
Oh.
You wouldn't necessarily know that, right? So there are 3 layers, roughly speaking, that I'll talk about. So the first one is creating that glow, that inner glow. And so there's an oval nature to it in the sense that it's going towards a face, right? I know that a face is going to be there. I'm preparing for that face. There's a central light in the center. I'll talk a little bit about how I plan light, how light is created. Well, I'll just start now, I suppose. So I have a strong fascination with images, image making, cinema, photography, light boxes, anything that creates a glow artistically or photographically, cinematically. So the images are prepared with that in mind, right? So the primary, the priming layer of light is all about that brightness, right? So the light, there's the optics, the way the light comes in and bounces, comes out. It's literally engineered for the light and planning for the light. The next phase was a drawing that came out of a GAN process, so the generative adversarial network. And basically I trained it on drawings. So over and over and over again, it would propose new drawings. And the drawing reminded me of my grandmother, a photograph of my grandmother. And so that's why I chose it. Now, the thing to understand is that this early phase of AI in terms of GANs was very small, had a very small output in resolution. So I had to process it in Illustrator. So of course, some computer science stuff is going on behind the scenes. But essentially I turned it into a vector file. So some of you might know the term vectors, but essentially it's a calculation that determines the curves, right? Where the anchor points are, where the curves go. But what's great about it is I can take it from something small and make it big. I could make a graphic for a skyscraper. I could wrap a bus. I could wrap an airplane or an aircraft carrier or whatever, right? And be faithful to that original drawing. So in this case, that then got transferred to the paper for this image. And then the last stage was another type of GAN called a style GAN. And style GANs create something that looks very faithful to what you would think of as a photograph. So some of you might have heard of the term or the website, thispersondoesnotexist.com. Have you heard of that? So you would refresh the page and it would be another person. And some of this occurred in the 2016 election, well, definitely 2020 election, and fake profile pictures and so on. So it made it very easy to create a sense of another identity. So there's a lot of interesting backstory around this. The title of this piece is called Headshot, kind of referring to the idea of a glamour shot, again, the inspiration coming from my grandmother, a photograph of her in her 20s. So the part that looks a little more photographic, like, came from that other source material, the quote photograph, the AI generated photograph. Does that make sense? So, but again, that idea of transformative nature, again, there was a connection with my grandmother, right? So I think what's really important to talk about is human intent when we're making work. And AI doesn't just wake up one day and say, I'm gonna make this thing, right? That's what humans do. They wake up, they have an idea, they go forward, maybe it takes months to get there. But in this case, the final transformation is all about light and oil painting, right? So this is, brushwork. I have a very particular way of working that is on that edge of perfection, right? So I don't want to exactly achieve perfection. I want to achieve a human touch, right? So I want it to be sensual. I want it to take on the characteristics of the medium. In this case, it's oil, right? So oil is very lush. So if you get up close to that picture, which I hope you will at the end, take a look at the way that it compares with the drawing, right? So graphite on paper has its very own characteristics, which make it, makes you want to do particular things or achieve a certain type of light. So this is my spouse. She has not actually seen this because she would not like it, just because she wouldn't like any image of herself. But it was very interesting in terms of people that I know. They were very interested in it. When they saw it, we talked about it. Another painter who also painted his spouse. And so there's this oral tradition also in terms of what we do, the way that we build on other people's work, whether it's subconsciously or intentionally. So in this case, this was a photograph that was taken on a train and the light was coming through the window. So there's always that human, connection with the material. So anyway, this was in a show at Whitespace a number of years ago. And so how many of you know Bob Ross? The painting instructor with the big hair. He'd always say, what's his term? Remember?
Little mistakes or something.
Happy accidents.
Yeah.
Yes. So I still remember watching Bob Ross in Hawaii growing up. And so he was probably the main source early on, I would say. So I'm the fourth painter in my family. So there's a long history of that in my family, but surprisingly, Bob Ross was the one who taught me early on in most things. But the reason I brought up Bob Ross is because the way that the hair exploded there was an accident. When I came back to it in the morning, this had happened, and I let it stay. I thought there was something about it that was interesting. So one of the things that I think is interesting when we talk about transformation is things like that, happy accidents. I'm interested in images that look like they're about to appear or about to disappear. And some of that might come from my fascination with the moving image, right? Animations, television, cinema, the way that things move. When I was growing up and starting to think about becoming an artist, I had a CRT television, cathode ray tube, right? And we didn't have very many channels, beginning of cable. And so there were the stations that we didn't subscribe to that I wanted to see. And sometimes you would see images and you'd wait and wait and wait. But I like to say I learned to love abstraction in that process because there was just so much happening. And the other thing is on that same TV was when I learned to code. So in 1982, I learned to code animations in BASIC. So one of my math teacher showed us in the classroom some animations. I said, show me how to do that. And he printed out the program. And then I just kept tweaking it and making my own. And so I think having this connection with the screen and thinking about my images as my own screen. And I had a very hard time in undergrad committing to painting because it was so still. I wanted it to move, right? So I did theater, I did video, I did dance, I did a lot of things that had movement in it. But over time, it became more and more relevant to me. I had more patience to sit down, to be alone, to be inside on a beautiful day. You know, the sort of sacrifices one makes to make an image. So this is 5 feet tall. So that if that helps you think about scale, I really like, again, that idea of transformation, doing something at a different scale than it exists in real life. I find that really interesting for some reason because it makes it a little bit more heroic or something different than what we are, right? If I'm always making a head at the same scale, it's fine, but it's not quite, I guess, what I want to achieve. So this is also from the same show. This is 5 feet. So both of these were friends of mine. And sometimes things happen. In this painting, so one of the other things is I make my own mediums quite often. So a medium is something that you paint with. Mediums transform paint. So you can go right out of the tube, but then you're only painting with one type of paint. I can have 10 different mediums and then I can have 10 different types of paint. You know, some can be runny, but slow, right? So I can achieve, if I want to have drips, I can slow the drips down so that I can choose which drips I want and which drips I don't want. That's pretty cool, right? So with time, with experience, I've learned how to, manipulate the materials that I have through polymerization in some cases, right? So in this case, it was drying too fast because the paint was technically half dry. Does that make sense? So chemically, it was already polymerizing. And so that makes a stronger surface, right? So like if you've ever had an iron skillet and you cure it, you're polymerizing a surface, right? And so, so someone who came to appreciation of science later in life, I take a lot of joy in some of those transformations. So I'll go through a couple of these images. So here's an image that there's actually a third one that's not in this picture, but this was a more recent exploration and kind of speaks to that idea, movement, transformation. And I actually did animate some of the faces from this series because I had built up a number of them and created a little GIF animation. And you can see that here. So it's not, it doesn't look like a traditional cartoon or anything like that, but that's not what I'm going for. So a number of my colleagues make short animations that push the boundaries, that don't have perfect keyframes, if you know what that means, like that super clean transformation, but there's this continuity that I think is interesting, but different at the same time. So growing up in Hawaii, I had a lot of exposure to ink painting, Japanese and Chinese landscape paintings. And I still remember in the 2nd grade, my English teacher saying, put everything aside, we're gonna paint bamboo today. And he taught me, with sponge and the straw to blow the ink around, which if we go back to that image where the hair goes away, my interest in that would come from ink, right? So there's that painting that initial stage was done in acrylics, which kind of mimic watercolor a little bit or ink a little bit because it's water-based. So in these are ink on paper purely from my imagination. So that's the other aspect of the portrait series, is that none of that was based. I mean, there are a couple that I showed you that predate the Hotel Mirror show, but Hotel Mirror was purely from my imagination. So this is airbrush. So if we're talking about technology, it's very interesting to think about. It's called a brush, but it's not quite a brush, right? It's literally spraying nanoscale pigment out of a very tiny aperture, and you can achieve some pretty interesting effects that way. So the image on the left comes out of a silhouette from an adversarial network, and you wouldn't necessarily know it, right? So I think, again, that's for me personally, I don't want to foreground the technology. That makes sense, right? So there's a lot of, we talk about intent in art, right? So what is your statement? What is your intent behind it? And, like I said earlier, it's not necessarily, don't start with, oh, I want to make something in pencil. I want to make something in that. You might know that that's a secondary thing. All right, let's keep going. Right, so I have a couple of images from classroom. So this is with a student group showing them how to make paint and letting them make some paint. So, paint comes in a jar, it comes in a bag. In this case, the pigment was fairly non-toxic, so we didn't have to have masks and follow OSHA rules and all that. Some pigments can be a little bit more intense. So over the years, I've let the professionals do that work, because it's almost impossible for me to achieve the safety standards to do this properly. So when we go outside at LMC, I like to say that this is our new studio, the newest studio at Georgia Tech. So, but in this case, what we do in this project is we do a little bit of color theory. So learning about additive and subtractive color. When we work in paint, it's subtractive. When we work digitally like this with a projector, it's an additive process. So red, green, and blue versus CMYK. And so on the left, this is from Georgia Tech Europe. On the right, this is from the VIP course, where they're doing with something that's called a blind contour drawing. So they have to draw the other person without looking at their page. And it's very fun to see what happens. And usually we'll do some sort of a best of, take the best one and embrace it, right? So just generally speaking, the first reaction is, oh my God, it's crazy, right? But I'm interested in a generative sense that that's something that you would never do if you were looking, right? So I'm interested in creating opportunities that are completely transformative, that come up with some unexpected result. And that's why I was really interested in GANs in the beginning, because they were just so strange and interesting that it was almost impossible to come up with something like that on one's own. So on the left side, we're working in grayscale and black and white, because there's a lot of, well, it's hard to get into all of it here, but there's different stages: pure black and white, binary image, grayscale image, and then color image. From a grayscale image, we can use tools, digital tools, like in Illustrator, for example, where we can recolor a grayscale image, just like that. So we can apply a Renaissance palette, we can apply a contemporary palette, and so on and so on. And just, again, that idea of generative, coming up with many possibilities quickly, right? So the work that comes out of the black and white phase, grayscale, can be used for a long time. We can create archives that other students can use. We can create data sets that AI can learn from, and so on and so on. So outside here on the right is a graduate course, a visual design course, and that day we were exploring alternate grids, so something separate from just a square or rectangle or the isometric grid. And so in this case, one of the interesting outcomes was a grid that was taken from the pebbles and the surface of the Skiles courtyard there. So these are AI generated images that have been altered with color and so on. And you'll notice that some of these are a little bit creepy, right? And so I think there's opportunities there, conversations to be had, you know, someone you could say, oh, it's some dystopian thing. AI is making crazy things, right? You could immediately lean into the negative aspect of that. But as a human, if you're going to respond to it, how can you soften that up, right? Can you humanize it just through your own sensibilities, through color, through some other sort of transformation? So on the right, these are some very early experiments. On the left, this is a transformative action done through Procreate on a tablet. So I don't know how many of you have ever done something like that. So this is for that painting there. So
Those AI?
yeah, this is the second stage of that painting over there. So on the left, that's the outcome that came from the computer generated image. And on the right is the vectorization of it, right? So there was a transformation into a pure binary image. Can you guys see that a little bit? And so when I transferred that image on the right, I did it purely by sight and very quickly. I didn't do like a one-for-one transfer of it. So again, that sort of transformative thing. There's a lot of jagged edges on it, you know, so I wanted to transform it more into my hand. Does that make sense? So there's always that process of making it one's own, I think, you know, for an artist. So these are experiments on the iPad, various levels of abstraction and representation. This is strange image.
Tiger Man.
This is graphite, but this came out of a 3D model on an iPad. So this is all 3D. It was sculpted as though it was clay. Then it was transformed into glass, like as a material, you know, virtual material, and then lit, colored in different ways. And then this is the drawing that came out of it. This is, okay, so where'd it go? So this is a process called interpolation, where it is an animated process. These never made it to prime time. Didn't quite reflect what I would want to do. So it was supposed to be in a show. I had a plan for it. So there was going to be a monitor that was attached to a painting. So it's going to be an image within an image, almost like Zoom, where you're the little talking head inside of the other thing. But I couldn't get it to reflect on, you know, what I felt was my work. So all right, some other experiments. The one on the left reflects my interest here at Tech and creating like units that can function like a pixel, right? But that can also be physical. That makes sense. So something that we can turn into like a mosaic or a tile system or something like that. There are things that I've done where you can actually embed text into it, right? So you can hide code in it. You could have a very simple command line or a poem. You could code a poem into it. Okay, so this is one of the more recent series that I've been working on, and you can see the frame drawing over there on the wall is just a drawing that I've done. And so sometimes I do just very normal things. In this case, just a simple pencil drawing on paper. But one of the things I'm actually most interested in is the way that that rectangle just fades in the background. And this idea of, is it a table in the reception? Is it, the idea of space? How do I create a sense of architecture that creates opportunity rather than limits opportunity? Okay, I'm gonna have to go through. So this is that image over there, framed. So a note about hotels and lobbies. So growing up in Honolulu, I often had free reign of multiple hotels at the same time. And so my father worked at the Hilton Hawaiian Village when I was little, so around 4 years old, and I would hang out by the koi ponds or the lagoon or the ocean or the parking lot or the lobby. But I could also just walk to the next hotel and the next lobby and so on and so on. So there's this world, I think, this idea of the diaspora, all of us are, or many of us are away from our home. And so we try to recreate that through community, or in my case, through my work. And I really find it interesting. Okay, I'm just gonna get it up. The white elephant is that the white lotus, yeah? So people always want to say, oh, white lotus. Okay, sure. Are you familiar with the white lotus? So that's fine, I suppose, but there are many representations of the idea of a hotel in literature, in film, and any number of things. This is a 6 by 8 foot painting that's still transforming. Should I tell the story about the
No.
painting? Okay. This is a sketch. So taking the silhouette of an existing photograph, but transforming it through marker and just kind of letting go of some of the control that I have. These are some dolly experiments where I bring in architecture, where I bring in figures. So I play little games with them digitally to like kind of come up with ideas, things that may or may not come into paintings. I have a strong interest in photography, film photography especially. And so sometimes I'll plug in the exact settings that I would have on my camera, right? What lens, what film, what exposure, what aperture, and so on and so on. And using the language to describe the scene that I would want to create. So, this idea of creating a virtual diorama that is my playground, right? A sandbox to come up with imagery. And so you'll notice they're very vague, right? On the left-hand side, I was very specific about the species, ranunculus in this case. The one on the right is a little bit better. Orchids in this case, and you'll notice the depth of field where it's very vague in the background. It creates an opportunity for a little bit of mystery, a little bit of interpretation. And this is a project that I've been working on for a number of years. So this is essentially an algorithmic mosaic system. So this is digital, and I'll show you some of the physical pieces here. So each of these is 3 inches across. It's laser cut out of MDF, painted in oil. And you can see here some of the textures and the colors. So there's a precision that comes with the the ability to literally plan through an algorithm what the outcome is, but also having that texture, that human texture and human touch. Okay, I'm gonna stop there.
That's very good.
Got a little bit too far.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I see that there are more people on Zoom.
Okay.
So any questions from our Zoom friends? For our friends in Zoom? Any questions? Okay.
You mentioned about the.
Can you speak louder, please?
Yeah, so you mentioned about the graphite drawings which are done using AI. So a large part of the graphite drawings are the coarseness of the paper, like the roughness of the paper on which you draw, which
Right.
is a 3D effect. So how is AI able to like implement that aspect into its drawings?
Oh, well, just to clarify, there was the stage where I was training it on drawings. So when I say drawings, I mean that I was stripping information out. So are you familiar with edge detection? Creating edges, essentially. So it's it's an algorithmic process that basically scans an image for contrast, right? So it's how we recognize form. And so one of the first things, when they talk about the black box and AI, if you've ever heard that, a lot of speculation. The first thing that computer scientists will say is that the first thing is probably edge detection. And it's also how we see, right? So when we talk about neurological development and stuff, we talk about food and predators, and as to how we develop our sense of sight. So where is our source of food, and where is where's something that's hunting us? How do we get away? So I think that's probably a fairly simplistic idea of that, but it runs a very simple algorithm that just says, basically looks for a significant contrast. So if I had a light gray next to another light gray, it wouldn't pass the test, right? Whereas if I held up this next to my white, it's extreme, right? So it passes a simple calculus. And so then it essentially creates a drawing or something that we can recognize as a drawing that I can interpret into something on paper or some other surface. Yeah. So there's no sensitivity yet to the type of surface you suggested with like a smooth paper or a rough paper. Yeah. So I think I mean there are devices. I have friends who have plotters where they can rig a pencil or a marker and draw something that we creatively code. But it's only one size fits all. I mean, there's no sensitivity to pressure yet, right? So, and that's where that human touch comes in. Like it took me a long time to be delicate enough to draw.
Yes, Lizzie, you can ask in the chat. A message from Lizzie. Hi, Mark, great work. Lizzie, you can. Do you have a microphone? You can talk on the microphone if you can.
Can you?
Yeah, from Liz. Yeah, if you can.
From the chat.
From the chat, is down there.
Where did it go? There we go. What would you say about the discrete versus?
She can't. Okay. Yeah, please, Lizzie, you can ask. So that's a question. What would you say about the discrete versus the continuous in your thought process or physical studio processes? That's a very interesting question.
Well, I love that I don't actually know how to answer that. So, can you clarify the discrete versus the continuous? I like that.
I like it too, yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
I think of digital pixels as discrete
that's discrete, and maybe.
and maybe paint as continuous. Yeah,
Okay. So I think, I've been at Tech 9 or 10 years, I've lost track, but,
and speak louder.
yeah, I've found that I try to make, analogies between the physical surface and the digital surface. So we have the XY as the warp and the weft, right? Are you familiar with weaving, warp and weft? When we put pencil down, when we put pigment down onto a surface, there is a grid. There is an inherent grid in the process, right? Or we're very used to thinking in measurements that go on the X and they go on the Y. So, I think there's a lot of continuity between them. The brushes in the digital space have gotten a lot better, if we're talking about something like Photoshop or Procreate, versus when I first started working in the digital space, a lot of things have transformed. I still think the physical space is ultimately more interesting. I have a little bit more, it's a little bit more dynamic. The digital is always trying to catch up with the physical, right? It's always going to play catch up. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. I'm sure I'll think of something better as soon as I leave. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. Other questions from either our friend in Zoom or here in the classroom?
Question?
You're an artist. She's a very good artist.
Oh, is that right?
You can say something.
No, what's your favorite medium? Or like, I'm actually very interested in, you were saying that sometimes you make your own paints and stuff. So do you like gather things? I've seen things where people take stuff from outside, like flower petals and things like that like inspire them and then make paints out of that. So I guess like, what
have I played with? I've played with everything from turmeric, so spices to tea, berries and that sort of thing. I have friends who are much more adventurous in making their own watercolor paints, mostly out of necessity because they have some allergies and toxicity and that kind of thing. I have had some of the pigments in my collection since I was in grad school. I came by a box of pigment at a yard sale for $5, and I kept adding to the collection over the years. Some of the stuff I use is scary if you don't use it properly,
Cobalt blue. Which is like I went to his studio once and he pulled out this very toxic pigment, cobalt blue. It's like I freak out. I mean, anybody was like nothing was. You're not even using the gloves, It's like.
Wow.
No, I mean, he knew how to manipulate it, but no, it was scary for me. It's very toxic. They have very toxic stuff. Like.
So yeah, it's good to be aware of, careful with your materials, Trying to think, I feel like I'm failing you. Yeah, a lot of it is about how light fast it is, so meaning how long will it last? And so sometimes that's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you want something to only be around for a little while. There are some lights where you can put a stencil down or a shape down, and it will show on the white, and then it'll disappear over the course of a couple of days. So, like there's something where if it's exposed to light, it actually darkens. So it's photosensitive, which I think is really interesting. There's opportunities to put picture on a canvas and have it only last for a couple of days. That's interesting. Or you can hide messages in the paint for someone to find later through X-rays or some other sort of imaging. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you because I am on a tight schedule. At 1:30, we're gonna go downstairs. There will be pizza and there will be the group study session. And I don't wanna be late because last week I was late and there were students waiting for more than 20 minutes. So thank you very much, Mark, for being here. And thank you, Arash, Carol, Michelle, Lizzie, to be here. And see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. All the best. Bye.
Thank
Okay,
you.
let me stop the recording. Excellent.